Have you ever looked at someone in a position of power and thought, how on earth did they get there? We've all seen it. Individuals who seem utterly incompetent, somehow rising to authority, while more capable minds remain in the shadows. Think of history's Emperor Nero, said to have fiddled while Rome burned. Or more recently, corporate figures like Elizabeth Holmes, who built a multi-billion-dollar empire on technology that never worked. It's a pattern so common, it feels intentional. But what if it is? What if there's a twisted logic behind why the least qualified so often end up with the most influence? Today, we dive into the mind of one of history's most misunderstood political philosophers, Nicolo Machiavelli, and his brutal insights into why stupidity and power so frequently walk hand in hand. But this isn't just dusty old philosophy. It's a psychological reality shaping our modern world, from corporate boardrooms to political thrones. The uncomfortable truth? Sometimes being smart is exactly what keeps you from gaining power. And understanding this paradox might just help you see through the manipulation that governs society, or even help you carve your own path to influence. In 16th century Florence, exiled from the political life he loved, Machiavelli wrote what would become one of the most controversial political works in history, The Prince. Unlike the idealistic thinkers before him, Machiavelli wasn't interested in how rulers should behave in a perfect world. He wanted to understand how power actually works in the real one. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. This one line strikes at the core of Machiavelli's philosophy. He understood that in the game of power, perception often outweighs reality. And there lies the first clue to our paradox. Appearing competent is often more important than actually being competent. Machiavelli noticed that rulers who were too intelligent often created problems for themselves. Why? Because intelligence comes with certain traits that, in the brutal world of power, become liabilities. Nuanced thinking, ethical hesitation, self-awareness. Think about what happens when a genuinely intelligent person enters a power structure. They see complexity where others see simplicity. They admit limitations where others make grand promises. They question themselves, while others project unwavering certainty. But in a system where boldness beats thoughtfulness, those intellectual traits become handicaps. Contrast Socrates, who questioned everything and was sentenced to death, with the populist leaders throughout history who rose by offering simple, absolute answers. Socrates' wisdom, "I know that I know nothing," made him a philosophical titan, but a political failure. Meanwhile, countless leaders gained power by claiming they alone had all the answers. A controversial 2017 study in the Journal of Management backed up something many find unsettling. Intelligence correlates with leadership effectiveness, up to a point. Once an IQ crosses around 120, it actually starts to hinder leadership emergence. Why? Because exceptionally intelligent individuals often struggle to connect with those who can't follow their complex thoughts. In other words, being too smart might actually keep you from ever gaining leadership in the first place. Whether or not you fully accept that study, it forces us to reconsider. What kind of intelligence really helps someone rise to power? Because raw intellect alone isn't the whole story. If intelligence can be a liability in the game of power, what traits actually help people climb the ladder? This leads us into a powerful psychological principle, one that explains why we so often follow the wrong people. Ever notice how the loudest voice in the room tends to gain the most attention, regardless of what it's actually saying? This isn't random, it's wired into us. In the 1990s, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Krueger identified what's now known as the Dunning-Krueger effect. a cognitive bias where people with limited ability drastically overestimate their competence, while true experts tend to doubt themselves, fully aware of how much they don't know. As Shakespeare once wrote, "The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool." Shakespeare captured this principle centuries before psychology gave it a name. But Machiavelli would have recognized it instantly as a fundamental truth about power dynamics. Modern research backs this up. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that individuals who displayed overconfidence were more likely to be perceived as leaders by their peers, regardless of actual competence. The appearance of certainty was more persuasive than demonstrated expertise. Consider historical figures like George Armstrong Custer, whose supreme confidence led to catastrophic military decisions, yet still earned him rapid promotions and devoted followers. Or take the tech world, where founders who speak in bold, visionary absolutes often attract massive funding, outshining more experienced, measured entrepreneurs. WeWork's Adam Neumann exemplifies this. Despite a shaky business model, his unshakable confidence pulled in billions in investment and built a near cult-like following. This pattern repeats around the globe. Japan's Masayoshi Son of SoftBank lost $70 billion on failed investments, yet continued to maintain investor confidence through sheer force of personality. In Russia, many oligarchs didn't rise through competence, but through connections and charisma during the chaotic post-Soviet privatization. Singapore, in contrast, built institutional safeguards designed specifically to prevent confidence from overpowering competence in leadership selection. In 2012, researchers from Stanford and the University of Houston found that narcissism, not competence, may be the strongest predictor of who emerges as a leader in unstructured groups. And those groups led by narcissists, they didn't perform better, they just thought they did. Why does this happen? Because our brains rely on shortcuts when evaluating others. Confidence signals competence. Decisiveness suggests clarity of thought. These shortcuts helped our ancestors survive in simpler environments. But in today's complex world, they often lead us astray, because true expertise rarely comes wrapped in loud certainty. It usually comes with hesitation, nuance, and a deep awareness of what's not known. This confidence illusion helps explain how incompetent individuals can initially rise to power. But something even more insidious helps them stay there, entrenching themselves deep within organizations and institutions. Machiavelli noticed something crucial about power structures. Incompetent leaders tend to surround themselves with even less competent subordinates. In The Prince, he writes, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." He understood this game all too well. Weak leaders deliberately select weaker underlings, not by accident, but by design, because they pose no threat, no challenge to their authority. This creates a ripple effect, where incompetence becomes institutionalized. Dr. Tomasz Chamorro-Premuzic, an organizational psychologist, describes this as competence threatening. Insecure leaders feel threatened by talented team members who might expose their limitations or eventually replace them. So instead of choosing the best, they choose the safest, loyal, compliant, non-threatening. Think of it as a competence drought, spreading outward from the top. In Emperor Commodus's court, capable administrators were systematically replaced by flatterers and entertainers, accelerating Rome's collapse. In contemporary Brazil, the Centrão political system institutionalizes this dynamic. Political appointees gain positions through personal loyalty, not merit. In Zimbabwe under Mugabe, the late regime saw the same, replacing skilled administrators with partisan loyalists, devastating the economy in the process. This isn't random, it's structural. It's what organizational scientists call homophily, the tendency of individuals to associate with others like themselves. In power structures, this means incompetent leaders build echo chambers of incompetence, insulated from conflicting viewpoints and constructive criticism. Ask yourself, have you ever worked in an organization where asking questions was discouraged? Where raising concerns was labeled as not being a team player? That's the network effect of this system at work. And even when we know this dynamic exists, we still get seduced by it. We still find ourselves drawn to leaders who offer simple, confident answers. Why? Because it speaks to something deep in our psychology. Despite our best intentions, incompetence thrives because we are wired to crave certainty in an uncertain world. Real experts are almost always careful in their claims. They acknowledge complexity. They admit what they don't know. They recognize trade-offs. But these intellectual virtues don't satisfy our psychological needs. The great majority of mankind are satisfied with appearances, as though they were realities, and are often more influenced by the things that seem than by those that are. When Machiavelli wrote these words, he wasn't just describing politics, he was describing human nature. We crave certainty, even when certainty is impossible, even when it's a lie. Think about what happens in a crisis. People rarely rally behind the leader who says, "This is a complex situation with no easy answers, and it will require careful thought and inevitable trade-offs." They follow the person who boldly proclaims, "I alone can fix this." The solution is simple. Just look at how actual environmental scientists speak about climate change. They speak in caveats, ranges of possibilities, and nuanced policy suggestions. Now compare that to how popular figures on both sides of the political spectrum frame the issue, with absolute certainty. The scientific approach, while intellectually honest, struggles to compete with the psychological comfort of a simple narrative. Or, take healthcare debates. Real medical experts emphasize complexity and the trade-offs involved in any system. Meanwhile, political figures offer tidy, feel-good solutions that promise everything, with no downside. So, which approach typically wins public support? The simple, certain one, regardless of feasibility. In a particularly jarring 2017 experiment, Yale researchers discovered something deeply unsettling about how we process political information. When participants were presented with mathematically complex policy scenarios, their ability to correctly interpret the data depended on whether the outcomes aligned with their political beliefs. Even more disturbing, the most mathematically skilled participants showed the strongest bias, using their intelligence not to uncover truth, but to justify the conclusions they already preferred. Cognitive psychologists call this need for cognitive closure, our desire for clear, definitive answers over ambiguity. Studies show that when people feel uncertain or threatened, their need for closure increases dramatically. They become more drawn to black and white thinking and more willing to follow authoritarian leaders who project absolute confidence. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. The more complex and frightening our world becomes, the more vulnerable we become to simplistic thinking and to the leaders who peddle it. It's like a psychological immune system failure. Right when we most need nuanced thought, we become least able to tolerate it. Ask yourself, have you ever found yourself drawn to a simple explanation precisely because it was definitive? Even when part of you knew the truth had to be more complicated? That's this principle at work, inside your own mind. But our comfort with simplicity only explains part of the puzzle. There's a more troubling dimension still, one that reveals why intelligence alone is not enough to resist manipulative power. This is where Machiavelli becomes truly unsettling. He suggested that moral considerations often handicap intelligent people in power struggles. In perhaps his most infamous line, he wrote, "It is necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain his position to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not use it according to necessity." While intelligent people often develop sophisticated moral reasoning, that same moral depth can actually weaken them in power competitions. Why? Because the person willing to cross ethical lines has access to tactics their principled rivals simply won't use. They can make promises they never intend to keep. They can deceive, sabotage, and exploit fears or prejudices others won't touch. Look at Cicero versus Julius Caesar. Cicero, brilliant, principled, respected, ultimately lost to Caesar, who crossed the Rubicon literally and figuratively, breaking norms his opponents still felt bound to honor. In modern politics, we see ethical candidates struggling against opponents who traffic in misinformation and character assassination. In organizational settings, researchers at the University of British Columbia found that psychopathic traits, like lack of empathy, were positively associated with rapid career advancement, especially when paired with charm. This pattern holds cross-culturally. In China, the archetype of the Shen Nu, the ruthless, hyper-strategic businesswoman, is celebrated. In Nordic countries, even with a strong cultural focus on collaboration, studies show that manipulative leaders still rise faster than their more ethical peers. Game theorists call this a race to the bottom. Once unethical tactics prove effective, others feel pressure to adopt the same methods, or risk being left behind. Over time, this corrodes the system itself, until unethical behavior becomes not the exception, but the rule. Understanding these darker dynamics might make the whole thing seem hopeless, but here's the crucial point. Not all systems reward incompetence and unethical behavior equally. By recognizing the specific conditions that allow stupidity to climb and thrive, we can begin designing environments that select for genuine merit instead. Machiavelli understood this. Different environments reward different qualities. Some naturally select for competence. Others create the perfect breeding ground for incompetence to flourish. So what determines which kind of environment develops? Several structural factors. First, feedback loops and accountability. In fields with clear, immediate feedback, incompetence is quickly exposed. A surgeon whose patients consistently die, an engineer whose bridges collapse. These roles demand genuine competence because failure is obvious and often catastrophic. But in environments where feedback is delayed, indirect, or easily manipulated, incompetence can thrive indefinitely. Think of political systems where failures are blamed on predecessors or external enemies. Corporate hierarchies where creative accounting hides poor performance. Media landscapes where being entertaining matters more than being accurate. All of these create fertile ground for the incompetent to rise. Second, institutional design and power distribution. Centralized power with weak checks and balances is a breeding ground for dysfunction. The collapse of the Soviet Union was accelerated by a system that concentrated authority in unaccountable hands. By contrast, Germany's dual-board corporate structure, where oversight is structurally separated from management, helps insulate against incompetent leadership. Third, information asymmetry and complexity. When success is easy to measure, merit tends to win. But when goals are ambiguous or performance is judged subjectively, style often trumps substance. Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, but to few to touch you. Machiavelli nailed this. In complex domains, most people rely on surface impressions. They can't evaluate real competence, so they default to confidence and charisma. Fourth, economic incentives. Systems that reward short-term gains over long-term value naturally select for leaders who prioritize optics over outcomes. The 2008 financial crisis exposed how deeply flawed incentives encouraged risky, short-sighted behavior, led by people who looked good on paper, but left devastation in their wake. Ask yourself, in your own life, which environments promote competence, and which ones enable incompetence? Recognizing these structural forces helps you navigate more wisely and see manipulation where others only see confidence. But even in well-designed systems, incompetent leaders still find ways to rise. How? By weaponizing human psychology. These leaders don't succeed by accident. They deploy specific tactics to manipulate perception and neutralize resistance. Tactics Machiavelli would have recognized instantly. First, they exploit tribalism and identity politics. By creating rigid in-groups and out-groups, they reframe all criticism as attacks from the enemy. This shields them from accountability and deepens their followers' emotional loyalty. Psychologists call this identity fusion, when a leader fuses their personal identity with a group's collective identity. Once this fusion takes hold, any attack on the leader feels like an attack on the group, and by extension, on you. Cult leaders like Jim Jones mastered this dynamic. So did authoritarian figures throughout history. In Malaysia, former Prime Minister Najib Razak exploited ethnic divisions to maintain power, even amid massive corruption scandals. In Brazil, Bolsonaro's political success leaned heavily on polarization, where identity often overrode factual reality. Second, they create chaos to overload your brain. By constantly generating controversies, scandals, and crises, they wear down your cognitive defenses. You can't think critically when you're mentally exhausted. If you're always reacting, you're never reflecting. This is cognitive overload by design. When outrage becomes constant background noise, resistance becomes harder to organize and easier to dismiss. Third, they use Orwellian tactics, what Orwell called doublethink, the ability to hold two contradictory beliefs at the same time. These leaders constantly shift positions, reframe failures as victories, and rewrite the past. The result? Truth starts to feel subjective, and without a shared sense of truth, accountability becomes impossible. The vulgar crowd is always taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. Machiavelli wasn't insulting people. He was pointing out a universal vulnerability. Our minds evolved for a simpler world, and in complex environments, we become easy to manipulate. Fourth, they exploit economic precarity. When people feel insecure about their jobs, their housing, their future, they become more susceptible to the illusion of strong leadership. A leader who projects certainty becomes incredibly appealing in uncertain times. The more uncertain the world becomes, the more seductive simple solutions feel. In post-industrial regions around the globe, economic anxiety creates the perfect conditions for incompetent leadership, the kind that offers easy scapegoats instead of honest analysis. Ask yourself, how often do you find yourself chasing the latest outrage instead of focusing on deeper, more consequential issues? That's this principle at work. In your own mind, recognizing these dark patterns is essential. But it's not enough. We need concrete strategies to protect ourselves and our communities from their influence. At the individual level, awareness is our first line of defense. Understanding the hidden forces that shape thought makes us less vulnerable to them. This defense rests on three practices. First, intellectual humility. The ability to admit the limits of our own knowledge. Research shows that intellectually humble people are better at evaluating ideas based on evidence, not confidence. This humility functions like a cognitive immune system, protecting us from manipulation and false certainty, the same way our body fights infection. Second, media literacy. the skill of separating depth from spectacle. It means choosing our sources deliberately, questioning presentation, and filtering for quality over quantity. Warren Buffett once said, "Really successful people say no to almost everything." Apply that to your information diet. Wise thinkers reject most noise and focus on clarity. Third, philosophical reflection. The practice of stepping back from the daily storm to ask deeper questions. The Stoics recommended this daily, a moment to detach from reactivity and regain perspective. As Francis Bacon wrote, "The wise man will make more opportunities than he finds." Reflection helps us shape our mental environment, not just consume it. At the collective level, institutional design is key. We can build systems that reward truth, competence, and accountability. 3 pillars matter most. First, accountability mechanisms, structures that deliver honest feedback, no matter how persuasive or charming a leader may be. Contrast a company with an independent board to one where the board rubber stamps executive decisions. The Boeing 737 MAX disaster showed what happens when engineers' warnings are ignored in favor of profit. There was no accountability, and lives were lost. Second, cognitive diversity. Not just a buzzword, a necessity. Diverse teams outperform homogeneous ones. They challenge assumptions, uncover blind spots, and reduce collective error. Third, transparency. Complexity should never become a smokescreen. Whether it's sunshine laws in government or conflict of interest disclosures in medicine, transparency makes it harder to hide behind jargon or secrecy. Education ties all of this together. It's not enough to teach technical skills. We must prioritize critical thinking and ethical reasoning. Athens created the academy. Florence birthed the humanists. Great civilizations don't just teach, they cultivate wisdom. So ask yourself, in your own community, which of these protections exist? Which are missing? And what kind of world might we create if our systems were built around competence, humility, and truth? As we close this exploration, we return to the man who inspired it. What would Machiavelli say about our modern predicament? Machiavelli has been misunderstood for centuries. He wasn't advocating for the dark patterns he described. He was exposing them. By understanding how power actually works, not how we wish it worked, he believed we could design better systems of governance. It is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles. This is the heart of it. Power deserves no inherent respect. It must be earned through its use, not its appearance. The intersection of Machiavellian insight and modern psychology reveals some deeply uncomfortable truths. But uncomfortable truths are exactly what we need if we hope to build a better future. The path forward isn't pretending these dynamics don't exist. It's understanding them deeply enough to transcend them. It's designing systems that account for human vulnerability instead of exploiting it. It's developing personal practices that strengthen our resistance to manipulation. Most of all, it's recognizing that, while stupidity may sometimes gain power, intelligence, coupled with moral courage, remains our best hope for creating societies where merit truly matters. What dynamics have you noticed in your own community? Have you seen these patterns play out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this exploration brought you value, consider subscribing or sharing it with someone who might benefit. Until next time, remember, understanding the darkness doesn't mean surrendering to it. It means gaining the power to create light.